Hi, welcome to This Leader. I'm Claire Laughlin, and you're in the right place if you're a leader who's ready to do the work, make a bigger impact on the world, and build the kind of workplace where people thrive. Hey, have you ever walked into a room and decided that the person across the table was the enemy before either of you had said a single word? Not because of anything they did, just because of the kind of meeting it was and where they were sitting. I know I have. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We often decide who's a threat before our brain even catches up. And once we've made that decision, everything that happens next gets filtered through it. My guest today has spent nearly 2 decades sitting on both sides of the negotiating table, where it's far too easy to think of the others as your opponents. Today, I'm interviewing Allyson Hauck. She's a friend and a partner at Sloan Sakai Young and Wong, where she practices labor law and represents cities, counties, and nonprofits in collective bargaining. And here's something that makes Allyson's perspective so unique. She's been on different sides of that negotiating table. She wasn't always just in this one chair. Allyson was the human resources director for the City of Monterey, negotiating with 5 different bargaining units in her own agency. She was also the chief human resources officer for Watsonville Community Hospital and guided it through a bankruptcy and a transition to nonprofit ownership. So she's negotiated as management and she's negotiated as the person that management hired. So she knows exactly what it feels like to sit in both of those chairs. What I love about Allyson is how honest she is about the parts that are still hard for her, even after nearly 2 decades of doing this. And it's hard. Allyson will tell you herself that she's a people pleaser. So you can imagine. But today, we're going to dive in deep and talk about trust, how to build it, how to protect it when things get adversarial, and what to do with your own mindset before you ever sit down at the table. This conversation started because Allyson and I did a presentation with some other presenters at Calpelra, a conference that we attend often in Monterey. And we talked very deeply about the mindset that filters through every time we feel like we have to negotiate. So I can't wait for this. I hope you enjoy it. Let's dive in. Here's my conversation with Allyson Hauck. Welcome, Allyson. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Claire. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited for this conversation. You and I have had such wonderful conversations about the nature of negotiation and trust in the workplace. So I want to explore that together because I think that it's such a unique perspective to think about negotiating with the long view in mind. How will I build trust? So you've been on both sides of the bargaining table, Allyson. You've been inside organizations, negotiating with your own employees. And now you're back in private practice, representing cities and counties, and you're sitting across the table from unions, basically, right? So, what have you learned about successful negotiation from that double vantage point? That's such a unique set of experiences.
Yes, I think I've been doing this now for almost 20 years, and I'd say it's been a journey. And the interesting thing about negotiations is that they change given the time. So I've negotiated during the recession, during prosperous times, during COVID. And so it's a really dynamic environment. And there's so many different dynamics going on as far as who the players are and like who is my client? What am I trying to accomplish? I'd say I'm learning every day. Every day I'm like, why didn't I remember this lesson that I learned 15 years ago? Because it's it's emotional,
Yeah.
it's tense. It's kind of a situation that you don't have anywhere else because you're in a professional environment. However, there's yelling, there's crying, there's struggles. And so it's hard to kind of break down everything that I've learned. But I would say that one of the key things that I always think about when I'm approaching negotiations is, what am I trying to do here? And what I'm trying to do is obviously get an agreement at the end of the day. We're negotiating wages, hours, benefits. So we're negotiating like a labor contract.
Right.
We're trying to reach agreement with the union, but at the same time, we're also trying to work in an organization where you have management and employees that are public servants. We only work with cities, counties, and nonprofits. And so at the end of the day, you want to leave the negotiation table in a way where the parties have built trust and they are, collaborating and working better together, which I think that is what I've sort of evolved to be the most important thing that I personally am doing at the table is trying to foster this idea of creating an environment where parties leave the table better than they entered it.
Right.
And that's not always a shared goal. In that sometimes my client, that's not their goal. So I have to kind of put that to the side and try to, work with what my client wants. But I think that that's kind of one of my main takeaways having done this for 18 years and what keeps me wanting to do it
Yeah.
is that, I'm trying to kind of work through that process and build trust at the table.
Right. Wow, I love it. I mean, trust is my thing. I love that you enter these conversations this way. So tell me about your clients. What's the client perspective on this? You say for some clients that's not what they're about. Do you have those conversations in advance like about whether you will jump in and work with a client or represent a client this way based on this or do you just sort of offer it up?
I guess I would take back saying that it's not, I think it's always somebody's goal that they want to work well with their employees. But I also think that how much time it takes, whether we have time,
Right.
whether or not they've built enough trust at the table. Sometimes, so I guess I'll just break that down a bit to say typically what happens, and not always, but typically what happens is, I would meet with like the city executive team, with city manager, or with the head of the county and the HR human resources team. And we would come up with a set of strategies for like what needs to happen in these negotiations. We work with city council and board of supervisors to like get their goals for the negotiations. And then human resources sits at the table and I work with them. I would say from the most part, human resources, they go into that job because they like working with people and they want it to be a good experience. And so what we're trying to do, I'd say, is almost always have a collaborative discussion as much as possible.
Right.
But what we have at the table is we are sitting with, working with labor unions, employees that are representing, they're sometimes representing hundreds of their employees. They're advocating for their employees. And then they typically work with a union representative from, SCIU or California Nurses Association. And so oftentimes I'm coming to the table and there's already a dynamic established. And sometimes I'd say most of the times that dynamic is that the labor groups and the employee representatives have been working with human resources and they have a good relationship or they had struggles, but they're able to collaborate. Sometimes we walk into a situation where there is no trust, there's anger, there's very little patience, and we have a set of goals that we need to achieve in a limited time to do it. And so oftentimes we're just saying, just say no to them and just move on because we don't have time. But that's rare, but it does happen. And when that happens, I just have to kind of figure out how to work with it. Oftentimes we have labor unions where their representatives aren't allowed to have conversations with me, outside the table. So I'm just showing up.
Right.
We've not built a relationship. We don't have any kind of one-on-one dynamic. So it's a bit performative when you're walking in.
Yeah.
But for the most part, though, I would say that the idea of kind of creating and building trust is a shared goal with a management team, with a human resources team. So I'd say for the most part, that is something that we're able to do. At the end of the day, I mean, their goal is, how can we best reach agreement and how can we best move forward with employees? And so if my perspective is that we do that by building trust, I think that I get some leeway to do that.
Right.
And that is, the approach that I've always tried to take when I'm at the table.
That's great. So tell me about like just compare and contrast for me. An organization that really does embody that commitment to the long view versus, and I realize there's constraints. Okay, I'll just say there's constraints. There's only so much money. There's only so much time. I get that. But compare and contrast for me the difference between an organization that takes that long view, that like we are in negotiations, but these are people that we value. We want to express that value. We want to collaborate. We want to roll up our sleeves and find a mutually agreeable solution whenever possible, versus, again, hypothetically, an organization that comes in with a different perspective. I'm not saying they don't want to build trust, but that is not their primary objective. And they're really thinking more in terms of, we have to make this bottom line right now, no matter the cost, for example. But what plays out differently there in those two scenarios, or what do you see and experience as the person that's bridging these two worlds?
So I would say that, a team that really functions well and wants to build that trust, we actually spend time preparing for negotiations. And then we also spend time educating employees on where management is coming from. So if there's constraints in the budget, we spend time, the finance director will come in and be open to taking questions. Will, be able to hear from employees that they're scared, they don't believe us, they think that there's funds that we're not, talking about, or that the priorities of the city or the nonprofit are not what they think the priorities should be, or spending money here instead of valuing us as employees. And so having those conversations with them and spending time to explain to them why management has the perspective that it does, or why management is proposing what it is, and being available to answer questions thoughtfully and, with some transparency,
Right.
so that employees might not agree, but they understand the perspective of where you're coming from.
Yeah.
I think is really important. And I would say that's kind of one of the main areas. And then also being able to sit at the table and hear criticism and hear anger and not react to it and not get too defensive. And I would say that human resources directors, I have learned so much by sitting with them and then being one of them,
Right.
about kind of that ability to just not take it personally, because it gets personal, it gets emotional, but to just maintain that kind of curiosity at the table and to be sitting with a group of employees that are willing to go through that.
Yeah.
So kind of like that sort of patience, that, you know, regulation, and then also just knowing that there is that dynamic. I don't know where I heard this. I might have heard it from you, Claire, because you've taught me so much over the years. But I do sort of envision sometimes when we're hearing a lot of anger and hostility at the table from employees that, whatever it is that built that up, like it's like a big balloon, and they're not going to be able to sit down and collaborate with us until they get all that air out. And that is sometimes one meeting, that's sometimes three meetings. And so just kind of the patience to sit through and to listen with curiosity and have the time to do that is something that I think is important to have kind of a healthy negotiations where you are able to, leave it with more trust than you came in with. And sometimes this is because time is critical. And, for example, like a nonprofit might find out that they've just completely lost their funding overnight, or during COVID when all of the sudden, I was at a city who was dependent on hotel transit TOT tax, and it just was zero all of a sudden overnight. So then you have to just react quickly, and you don't really have the time to sit through 10 meetings and hear all of the things. And you just have to say, this is what's happening, this is what we're doing, and move forward with that. And you just don't have the time. And so employees are left with like, making up their own why this happened, should have it happened this way, because we haven't really had the time to sit with them and kind of spend that time giving them the why this is happening and what are some other options. Can we explore different areas? We just have to act quickly.
Right.
Or if there's been, sometimes we'll have new leaders that come into a dynamic that's already been set for years ahead of them. There's a lot of distrust, and they might come in and it's so volatile that they are defensive and just like, I'm not going to sit through this. Like, we're just going to get up and leave. Like, let's not sit here through this because
The new leaders you're saying might feel that way or no?
potentially, yeah, like new leaders that come into an organization and they've got some, exciting ideas and they just see that there's already this distrust built and there's, assuming not good intentions at the table. So I'm just trying to think of ideas or ways when kind of that trust isn't really able to be built.
Yeah.
I would say though, honestly, I would say that it's the exception now. I do think that there is a lot of interest. And I think even just like the way that, kind of that shame and blame environment that maybe 20 years ago or, kind of more of a heavy handed approach, I do think things have changed over the course of my years doing this,
Yeah.
where there is more of an approach at the table where people are trying to collaborate.
Right. Boy, that is great. Let me feed back a few of these nuggets that I just heard. So you were saying that like in some of these high trust environments, you're looking at education, transparency, real listening, that kind of thing. You enter into these conversations with it sounds to me like kind of a global view of what might people need to know and understand. What conversations might we need to have leading up to this to really make sure that we're understanding each other's positions. So when we go into these negotiations, things go more smoothly and we're able to achieve more of a win-win perspective.
Yes.
Does that sound right?
Yeah. I do think that when I have sort of faltered and not built those relationships, or even midway through a negotiations, I'll be assuming that people have the information that they need, and we will maybe have done the education, and then sometimes we'll get a question across the table, and I realize, oh wow, we are not, we have not provided enough information. Like they are not understanding exactly why we're coming, forward with this information because there's so many things when you're coming to the table about like what does the budget look like, what are the priorities of the city, how much does it cost to provide these city services, and what pressures is city council getting from the public about what should be a priority, and are there like other struggles that are causing, like is there something else that's happening that is that we haven't explained, we haven't articulated enough, because employees are there doing their job, which is maybe parks and recreation, they're at the library, they're police officers, nurses, they're not sitting in all of these meetings where I might have had 10 hours of some, information sessions, city council sessions where I'm learning and processing. And then I come to the table having processed all that. And then I start talking as if they understand it as well. And that happens a lot. And it is something where you really have to step back and say, wow, we need to explain a lot more for them to understand why we have the proposal that we have or why we're not agreeing to the proposal that they have.
Right. A lot of background information, I'm sure. Well, let me tell you a quick story. Just something that happened to me one time, which I'm a little embarrassed to say, but this is true. I want to talk a little bit about the mindset of like a friend or a foe. You know what I mean? So I walked into a mediation one time where we were, I don't even like this language, but so I was one of the disputants, and I'm just going to put that in air quotes because it's like, even the language, you're a disputant, you're in a dispute, which we are. We were in a dispute over I don't know, a fence or something. I think it was like a land boundary. And anyway, so I go in and I'm one of the disputants and I am literally in the middle of being certified as a mediator at that time. So I am in up to my elbows in like all the tactics of trying to understand both sides and everything else. But I'm in one of these things and I go into the room and I see the other disputant across the waiting room. And I caught myself so clearly in the, there's the enemy type mindset.
Yes.
It is so weird. Okay, so I'll redeem myself here for a moment saying I just recently was in another kind of a dispute and I approached it completely differently. Like I went to the courtroom. I went in there and I just had a lot of openness and I was really thinking about the other person's perspective and how they got there. And I was thinking about all the good conversations that we had had over the years and all these things. But I did notice that I was on the receiving end of feeling like, that she wouldn't speak to me, she wouldn't look at me. And I thought, man, we've had years and years of a good relationship. And we still need to negotiate these finer points, for sure. We need to get to the end of this dispute. But ultimately, I went in with a whole different perspective. And yet I still came up against that mindset. So I want to talk about the mindset because you've spoken to me in depth about what you think after being in this world for so many years. What is happening there in terms of our sort of collective consciousness? Why do we see these things as so adversarial? Is there any way to change that?
So that is been something that I've worked with through the years. I feel like I've gotten more skilled at it over time, but it's always been something that I do struggle with. And I think it also depends on, how I'll take it in a different way depending on different groups. And I'll kind of describe that a bit. And I'll give you a story that I had that was kind of a similar thing where I was negotiating with a labor union and some employees that, very hardworking nurses, wonderful people, but it was very adversarial. And, they were advocating very hard for their perspective. And I lived with some of them in my community, and sometimes I would see them at the pickup line for school or in the grocery store, and I would have these thoughts of, "Oh, they despise me so much, and that's so unfair." And I would kind of go through all this, like, if they just knew that I care as well, and so I did the same thing, and I think I would show up to the table a little bit with that kind of defensiveness in my mind, being like, "This is so unfair. This is so unfair." And I was going to negotiations with them, and I was actually driving back from CalPELRA, which is the human resources conference that you've gone and spoke with me at in Monterey each year. And it was the year that was about gratitude. And so we had done all these sessions about gratitude and how to show up with gratitude. And as I was driving away from the conference to go to a negotiations, I was sort of seething. I don't want to go to this. They're going to be like, they're so angry. This is going to be so awful. We can't get past this. We're sort of in an impasse, and how do we get past this? And I stopped myself and I thought, I just went to an entire conference on gratitude. Like, how can I show up grateful? And then I started thinking about, I'm so grateful for the work they do. I am so grateful that they are willing to advocate for their employees. They don't get paid extra to sit at the table. Sometimes we're there till 10 o'clock at night. They're willing to do this because they obviously care. I'm so grateful that they care.
Right.
And so I changed my mindset, and when I walked into negotiations, I actually was honest a bit, not too much, because as I was saying to you earlier, I can tend to overshare and I have to work on that. But I did share with them that I was having a really hard time coming to these negotiations because we were just having such a struggle working through some of the issues, but I wanted them to know that I did hear them. I cared about their perspective and, kind of went through like my whole understanding of where they're coming from. But then I asked them to try to sit with where we're coming from. I'm not saying that solves the issue and solved the negotiation, but I do think it just shifted at least how I showed up and how I was viewing it and maybe the narrative in my head that I was telling myself
Right.
and allowed me to show up in a better place. And we did eventually reach agreement. And I do think that we worked well together after that.
Yeah.
So it was a good shift in mindset that I had. And that was just something that I was very aware of. Kind of, there's other times it's happened, but that was just one where I truly stopped myself and said, "You are going into this with the wrong mindset. Stop, rethink it, figure out how to shift it, regulate your own emotions. Like, you need to arrive in a place that's like calmer, more open to listening."
Right. I think that's so important. I'm so glad to hear that story because I do think that a lot of our trust issues can be shifted. I'm not going to say solved
Yeah.
because trust happens between parties. So you only have so much, control and influence. But I feel like so many of our trust issues can be shifted by kind of untangling ourselves from the immediate moment, shifting our mind to a bigger perspective that includes, hey, just like me, they have kids that they pick up from school, like just like me. They show up at the supermarket to do their shopping. Like, we're just all humans here trying to get through the struggles of the moment.
Right.
And that appreciation for really thinking and going like, you know what I really appreciate? I appreciate something here. Like in my case, when going to that thing I was thinking about, I appreciated the actual years of relationship that I'd had with this person prior to our dispute that were good. We had lots of good conversations and it felt like a very healthy relationship. So I was like, I appreciate that. And I understand I can get up above the immediacy of the moment and I can understand that this is hard. It's hard for her, it's hard for me, and we're both struggling with the hardness of it. You know what I mean?
And I do think as well that when I'm feeling more defensive than I am, I guess, compassionate towards my adversary, if we want to say adversary, then sometimes I think I still have more to learn here, or I'm still like, there's something about how I'm showing up that maybe I'm not yet okay with.
Yeah.
Because when I approach from a place of just more understanding and, okay, they're very upset about this. I'm not going to take it personally. I'm not going to get defensive, but I'm going to listen to them because I need to learn why they feel this way so that we can work through it.
Right.
And I think the more that I've done this, I realize that when I'm feeling that defensiveness, that's when it's like telling myself, you need to figure out what's going on here because that's not how you're going to persuade them or that's not how you're going to reach agreement.
Right.
You really need to like understand what's going on, with them and how you're showing up. And that is something that I think that has changed over the years because when I was, a newer attorney and sitting at the table and sometimes I would walk into a meeting and I've had the union say to me, the labor rep, I have no idea how you sleep at night. How do you do this job? I can't believe you can actually show up and sit here and do this job. And my response would be to, like, kind of fight back on that, and that is not the right approach, or I would sometimes say, "Hey, if this is where you're coming from, we're gonna take a break," 'cause I didn't know how to respond without being reactive, without being upset and angry, and so it's kinda taken me a long time to work through that and just to be able to have those conversations come to me and to allow them to be said and just to try to figure out how to pivot it towards a more productive conversation
Right.
and not avoid it and not react to it. And that's been really hard, but that is something that I think is, a skill that I've built up. It's not something that I was innate in me, but it is something that I do think has helped over the years, with the experience and the mentorship from other attorneys I've worked with and other clients that I've had to kind of like to do that.
So evaluate this for me. So I was just thinking, I'm putting myself in that situation. I'm thinking, okay, what would I do? What would I say? If I had a moment to think about it, I might try a validation technique where like validation being, hey, what you're feeling and experiencing is valid and understandable based on where you sit, is basically what it is. So it might be saying something like, I understand why from where you sit, you might see that or feel that way. That's just off the top of my head. Would that set you up for failure later?
Sometimes it has, and that's the thing that's tricky about negotiations because you're dealing with dynamics in a room. You've got HR professionals sitting there with you that are at the end of the day going to work with employees that you're sitting with. And then you have the labor reps that are coming in to support the employees and show the employees like, "Hey, we're here for you. You need us."
Yeah.
And so it's just all these different dynamics and oftentimes you'll leave negotiations and then in city council meetings, the labor reps will come and they'll talk about what's happening in negotiations and they'll use your words against you or shape them in a different way. So I've said things before like, I understand that this is hard and that we're going to have some difficult conversations. And then I've had been at city council meetings where that labor rep comes over and says, you hired an attorney that came in and said, we're going to make your life hard and difficult. I'm like, no, that's not what I said.
That's not what I said, right?
That's not what I said. So I do think that your response, I could see that being on like a one-on-one conversation when you're working with somebody. In my experience, how I've pivoted is first almost to not pay attention to the things that are said that are not productive.
Right.
Almost, I'd say ignore them. I don't know, that doesn't sound great, but truly not pay attention to them.
Yeah. Don't take the bait, right?
Don't take the bait and just say, let's talk about why we're here. And this is why we're here. And, we want to hear from you. We want to hear your ideas. We care about your ideas. We want to explain to you where we're coming from.
Yeah.
I really ask that we will sit and listen to you. And I want to give you the time to listen. And I hope you'll do the same for us.
Yeah.
So I just try to pivot it that way.
Right.
I'm saying that now, but sometimes, I interrupt. Sometimes they interrupt me and please don't interrupt me. Or, we kind of get into that feedback. But I do try to almost ignore it. And, one of the things that I struggled with when I started doing this work is that I am a bit of a people pleaser, which I think like there's some positive and negatives about that at the table.
Sure.
But I don't generally do well in kind of that adversarial and like, I don't think about the good comeback, Mostly, sometimes I might overreact, but I don't land that well. And I really struggled with, am I not strong enough to do this job? And
I was gonna say, and yet you dedicated your life to this, so that's pretty
I remember I was listening to audiobook of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, My Own Words, and in that, I'm not gonna get her quote right, but she did say, I wish I had the quote in front of me, but to tune out unkindness, untruth, because if you come from a place of anger, like reaction, like you're not gonna be able to persuade, something like that. And I remember thinking, "Oh, I'm not good at reacting to this, and I don't have to react to this."
right.
When they are unkind, I can tune it out. I can ignore it, tune it out, and try to remember why we're here and just stay on that course.
Right.
So that has really helped me. I haven't always done it. I sometimes will, I'm a human being and I don't always tune it out. And I do think as well, I like to let my clients know because sometimes they say, why did you just let them say that to you?
Right.
And I say, if we get caught up in that, we're not going to be able to get to the other side of this and we're not going to be able to explain to them really what's happening. Like we really need to try to pull this conversation into a way that's productive.
Yeah.
And so I really try to be calm and listen with curiosity of, okay, why are they saying this? Like what do I need to learn from this so that I can, respond to it in a way that's more productive?
I think that's so important. I mean, just stay focused on the goal. It's like I never studied Aikido specifically, but I remember learning this one piece that in the martial arts Aikido, like part of it is about letting that energy roll by you. So it's sort of transforming someone's energy when they're coming toward you as an attacker and doing what you need to do to let it go past you, not absorb it, not hit it with equal force, but rather transform it. And I think that's what you're kind of describing. I like that. I want to know what some of your trust building tactics are in these negotiation settings. What are some of the small things that you do to build trust and to create an environment where collaboration is possible? I mean, we've talked about some of the big ones, big picture education, big picture, transparency, and again, being a great listener. But I know that there's things that you do to try to create connection between you and the others at the table and things like that. So, what are some of the tactics that we can leave folks with? Because, again, our listeners, I don't assume that most of our listeners are doing these kinds of negotiations often, at least by themselves. But, we all negotiate things along the way. And I think the big picture here is how can you create the, sort of till the soil so that when you are in a position of needing to negotiate, you're coming from the best place and you have the best kind of chance for mutual success. So, what's some of the advice you might give to listeners about that?
Well, I think that this is a lot of the things you talk about on your podcast of like how to have these difficult conversations. We talked like about the education and I think that like being clear about things, being really clear about things is really important to just give them that clarity. I do think acknowledging that we might not come out on the same side of how we should solve the problem and acknowledging what their ideas are and acknowledging what their solutions are they think their solutions are.
Yeah.
Sometimes their solutions they might have all the information. I mean, employees that come to the table to represent other employees typically are ones that have been there for a pretty good amount of time,
Right.
but also ones that really do care about the city or the county or the nonprofit, care about the employee's experience there as well. And oftentimes we say this person will make a great manager if they ever want to, because they have that perspective. I mean, sometimes we do reach agreement and we are able to collaborate and come to a shared agreement. But during that process, there usually are times when we disagree on how to approach a solution. And so just really acknowledging that and to try to explain why we are not going to agree with that approach. So to give the information, the why, I always say, like, well, can we explain the why? What is the why? I actually sometimes have to come to the table not knowing what the why is. And sometimes I'm just like, I ask the HR director, can you talk to the community development director and understand why we're not going to be able to shift the work schedules for these employees? And I'll get back information. It's just not going to work.
Yeah.
It's just not gonna work, and so I just have to say, "Okay, well, I don't really know how to explain that to them," to just say, "Well, your idea is just not gonna work," but sometimes that's what I have to do.
Right.
So, we don't always get to give them the full example of the why. That can be the difficult piece of it because I do think that the more that they can understand your thought process and understand why you're coming to a certain solution, it does build that credibility and does build that trust.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a really important point for people who are not in bargaining, conversations or anything, but they're leading people and they have to sometimes introduce ideas or plans or things that need to be done in an organization. And you can't always share the entire why. You can't always share it. And yet sometimes it just has to be done. I can't tell you all the backstory, but this manager that you've had is now leaving us. You know what I mean? Or this or that. I mean, there's so many situations where you can't divulge all the details and you need to stay clear and firm on a point or, a solution moving forward. And that's kind of where you got to be. So in these places, I think what I'm hearing you say is like come forth with, your sense of humanity and be kind, be a good listener if you can,
Yeah,
and also just stick to the bottom line if that's what you need to do.
right. Yeah, I mean, it is kind of the basics of, how to show up and
Be a good leader.
be a good leader. It is a lot of that, and the thing with negotiations is that you are dealing with so many different things and you're just communicating a little piece of it. And oftentimes, then the information that you're given on the why that you're doing something, it might pivot and it might change. And so, let's say I've had a situation where we said we can't give wage increases because we can't increase the city budget at all because otherwise we'll be in a deficit and we'll have to cut services.
Right.
And then, as soon as we did that, things changed and they actually did realize some revenue that they didn't know that they were going to have. And so then they decided to utilize it for a new program. And then all of a sudden, the employees are hearing, oh, there's a new program out there and we just can't get wage increases. And so those are the kind of things, while not there was no bad intentions. And, there's just so many things going on, and there's a lot of pressure for this program from the public. And so the council and management does need to, they have so many different constituents that they are trying to work with. And it wasn't something that happened right away, but it happened within the next 6 months. And so that was something where, HR calls me and they said, look, oh, this is what's going to happen. We're going to show up to the table and we've just lost all our trust with them. Next time we let them know that, there's going to be a deficit if we give you wage increases, they're not going to believe us, and rightfully so.
Right.
So those are the type of things that if you can like pull back from negotiations and work with the city team, or just always making sure that, hey, here's what we said. If this is going to change, then if we could go back to that labor group and say, we know we weren't able to give you increases, but there's this other program that has to happen. And actually, it was a program that really needed to happen. Otherwise, there was going to be higher costs in the future. There was a reason that it was important, but we didn't have a chance to explain that. It was just reacting to it. And I think on every level that happens all of the time where, organizations are moving quickly and you are providing explanation on why something has to be done. And then all of a sudden it changes and you don't come back and explain why it changed. And so employees just are left with, you were dishonest or that was disingenuous rather than, there's a lot of moving pieces and here's why this is the new outcome versus what we told you it was going to be, 6 months ago or whatever it is.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of leaders it feels like a no win because I'm going to be transparent. I'm going to try to be as transparent as I can. Well, circumstances change, then I have to come back and be transparent about it. And then I still get pushback about why didn't you tell us this before and this and that. So it's difficult to deliver bad news no matter who you are, no matter what the surrounding circumstance.
Yes.
Well, Allyson, this is really helpful and thank you so much. You've got a wealth of experience and I know so many stories to share. Let me ask you, if you're speaking to a room full of leaders, some of whom, do formal negotiations like this, most of whom don't, though, I would say, let me ask you, what is your bit of advice for them? This leader, my podcast title stands for Transformational High Impact Secrets and Strategies. So, what is your bit of advice that could help any ordinary leader become a little more extraordinary if they just kept this one bit in mind when they have to negotiate? What's that bit of advice you might leave them with?
I think what I would say, coming from a place of like, this is what I struggle with on a daily basis. So I have to remind myself over and over of this piece, and we've talked about it here already. But I do think that the ability to hear difficult information, to hear a perspective that you might not agree with or that you don't think is maybe valid,
Right.
and not immediately react to it.
Right.
I mean, even say to somebody, "Thank you for sharing that. If I'm not ready, like if I feel my voice cracking or if I have a tightness in my stomach, I'll try to remind myself, let this process, don't react to it yet. You want to make sure you're reacting to it from a place of, emotional regulation, calmness, curiosity, and also what is it that you need to accomplish here and what is the best path forward to accomplish,
Yeah.
that goal. And do you need to persuade this person? Do you need to give them more information? What is it? And try to go away from the reactiveness of it to say, I'm going to counterpoint you because I think that that is like my first, like, what's the counterpoint to what they just said? And
Right.
if that's not the goal, then that's not the goal. And to try to sit with whatever it is, and even with that discomfort until you're very clear on how to respond.
Oh, that is golden, Allyson. Golden. So don't be reactive. If you can stay grounded, is what I'm hearing you say. Like, stay grounded. Don't be reactive. Regulate your emotion here. Stay connected to the goal. Yeah. Take a beat. Well, Allyson, where can people find out more about you?
Well, I work at Sloan Sakai, Young and Wong. You can go to the website there, and I've got my phone number and my email up there. And I'm also often at Calpelra. So for those that are in the public sector, that's a great time when we all get to see each other and connect. But yes, people can reach out to me through the website.
Excellent. I'll put the website down there in the show notes. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This is so fun to do this. We do this over coffee every once in a while, and this is a fun new way to do it.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you as well, Claire. Appreciate it.
So there you have it. I'm still thinking about Allyson driving away from that gratitude conference that she talked about, dreading a hard conversation and choosing before she walked into the room to show up grateful instead of defensive. That's not a negotiation tactic, my friends. That's a leader making a decisive and intentional mindset shift, right? And her choice changed how the whole thing went. So I'm also holding on to her advice that she said at the very end, right? When you feel your voice crack or that tightness in your stomach, you don't have to react yet. Let it process. Get to that place of calm and curiosity before you respond. Stay grounded. Take a beat. I have to remind myself of that all the time. These are very wise words. Thank you, Allyson. Thank you for being so honest about what this work really costs and for showing us that even after nearly 20 years, you're still learning it one negotiation at a time. Friends, you can find Allyson at Sloan Sakai Jung and Wong. Her links are in the show notes. And here's what I want to leave you with. Think about the last time you walked into a hard conversation, already braced for a fight. What would have changed? What would it have looked like to choose gratitude or being a trust builder instead before you ever sat down? If this conversation resonated with you, please share it with a friend who needs to hear it. And make sure you're subscribed and that you follow the show so you don't miss what's coming to next. Until then, go lead the way.